Okay, so good morning for those that are joining us today. My name is Latricia Vaughns, and I am the Research Development Administrator for the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. Just to give you a brief background of exactly what it is that I do. Specifically, I work with faculty in developing their proposals, assisting them with finding funding opportunities for their research projects, connecting them with different collaborators, and also other grantsmanship oriented type trainings and events related to grantsmanship and research development. So basically we're going to be talking about the grant life cycle. Basically that's from the beginning to the end, what you can expect during the process, how to or who you would communicate throughout the process, or communicate with throughout the process, and things like that. So this is just to give you like a visual of what you can expect. The first step in the process is usually idea generation. Basically, this is when you come up with an idea for what you think might be a fundable research project. And so the next step to that would be actually finding funding opportunities to fund the project. Once you figured out which sponsors you want to pursue, the next step would be to develop the proposal, which this to me is the fun part because there's so many moving parts to it. And once the proposal is fully developed, then you submit the proposal. And then once you submit the proposal and you've been awarded, there is the award management phase, which in most cases is referred to as post-award, but we'll get into that. And then once you have carried out all of the deliverables and the research within the project, then you have the award closeout phase. So with idea generation, this can stem from maybe your own strengths and weaknesses. I've had people come up with ideas just from random conversation or just doing something basic and they get an idea for a research project. It can also come up organically from casual conversation with colleagues. This is typically where a lot of research ideas come from. And then and also there's you come up with or you recognize that there's a problem and there's no feasible solutions available. So a lot of times faculty members or principal investigators will set out to find solutions to problems. Um, and so also with idea generation, you want to make sure that you evaluate your idea against what already exists. Again, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. So in doing so, you want to make sure that your idea is relevant. Is it something that's necessary? Is it something that's trending? Or is it something that's trending, but again, they haven't really found a solution to it? People have, started the research, but maybe because of lack of funding or lack of support that they haven't really gone deep enough into it. You also want to make sure that your idea is innovative. A lot of times sponsors are looking for not necessarily cutting edge research, but research that isn't a repeat of what's already been done. So you want to make sure that your your research idea is basically that it's fundable. And there's a couple of ways that you can go about ensuring that it is, and we'll get into that later. You also want to um, figure out what the key attributes of your idea are that make it stand out, because sponsoring agencies aren't going to fund stuff that already exists. They want to know, they want to invest in something that shows promise. And as you're developing your proposal, again, the people that you enlist to help you with your proposal development can help you to tailor that a little bit better so that you make sure that your project actually, your idea actually stands out. So the funding search phase is basically where you're scouring all these different places to see where there's funding that suits your project. So obviously the type of sponsors that we have are federal and non-federal. That's just the basic way of categorizing funding. With non-federal, you have state, local, foundation, which is probably the most popular type of non-federal sponsorship. And then you have helpful research databases that help you carry out these searches, such as Pivot. So the University of Houston actually has a subscription to Pivot because it's subscription based. And it's free to faculty, staff, and students as long as you use your institutional email account. You can't use like your personal Gmail or Yahoo or else it won't work. So in order to take advantage of it, you do need that uh.edu email address. But setup's fairly simple. And I can show you later on in the presentation where you would go to for that. But another one that I like to tell people about is the Foundation Center, which they strictly focus on private foundation type of opportunities. I believe that one is subscription based as well, but they allow they have like a preview function where you can still review a considerable amount of opportunities. It's just if you want to dive a little bit deeper, it does require a subscription. And then there's grants.gov, which is absolutely free to anyone to use. This is the government's pretty much one-stop shop for all federal opportunities, and they're combined into this one database. So that's another one that you could use. Another one that's not listed here, which is relatively new for the university, but other universities have put it into practice, is Grant Forward. Grant Forward is pretty similar to Pivot in that it combines all of the different funding opportunities available, whether it be federal, state, local, foundation, corporate. It pretty much combines all of those into one place. And so the University of Houston, again, pays for the subscription for that. So it's free to faculty, staff, and students, again, as long as you have a uh.edu email address. And that's Grant Forward. So again, diving a little bit into the types of funding opportunities available, you have solicited proposals where those are pretty much sponsor initiated. So essentially that's when you see like a call for proposals from different sponsors. And there's a couple of ways that these funding opportunities are referred to. You have funding opportunity announcements, or you could have requests for proposals, RFPs, or you can have requests for applications, RFAs, and a lot of times with solicited proposals, I know like with RFAs, like specifically with like NIH, those are for like specific opportunities. If it's a request for applications, it's usually a specific opportunity set aside from like their general opportunities that they have. And there's usually, there's not like a general round of application due dates. It's usually one set specific application due date. So if you're ever wondering like what's the difference between an RFP and an RFA, that's one of those examples. And then you have unsolicited proposals, which are usually investigator initiated. And most of the proposals, like with NIH and NSF, are investigator initiated. And they usually fall on this under the this one general umbrella of a category, proposal category. And then there is a letter of intent, which is basically like a pre-application or a pre-proposal to a full proposal. Usually letter of intents are required when they're trying to narrow down the different proposals that they get. And usually a letter of intent is, most of the time, a letter of intent is required before you can actually submit a full proposal. It's not all the time that it's required. It just depends on the agency or the sponsor. Sometimes people like to use letter of intents to pretty much get an idea of the type of proposals that they're getting so that they can better assign the reviewers. So usually not, sometimes it's not a make or break thing, but sometimes it is. It's just, you really have to pay attention to the sponsor guidelines. And then there's rolling applications, where a lot of times unsolicited proposals with some sponsors, they'll allow a continuous cycle of applications. There's really no specific due date. Again, that comes from, you'll be able to decipher that just from paying really close attention to the sponsor guidelines. And also, this, I can't stress this enough, because a lot of times people kind of like zero in on funding databases, and they don't really, you know, divvy too much outside of that. That's pretty much the only way they try to find funding opportunities. But I always tell people to check the publications that you're reading as you're doing your research. Check the publications acknowledgement sections, because a lot of times the authors of these articles will list where they got funding to complete the research or to, you know, write the article. And a lot of times it might be relevant to what you're actually trying to accomplish. Another thing I like to tell people is to network, network, network. You will be surprised at how many funding opportunities you could potentially open yourself up to just by networking with different colleagues, because you never know who knows who. So just keep that in mind. It's a really simple concept, but you'd be surprised at how many people don't actually do that. So another thing I like to tell people to do is, if you're part of any professional organizations surrounding your field, always double check their websites. A lot of times they offer their own set of funding opportunities for specific research ideas or research fields. And a lot of people don't really think to check with these professional organizations that they are a part of. And sometimes you don't necessarily have to be a member to partake in professional organizations funding calls for proposals. A lot of times I've seen usually that different professional organizations will allow people to apply even if they're not a member, but funding, whether or not you get the award or not, could be contingent upon you eventually becoming a member. So keep that in mind. Again, just pay attention to the guidelines. And then also lastly is newsletters. Maybe you get newsletters from these different professional organizations. A lot of times you can subscribe to different listservs from professional organizations, even if you aren't a member. Sometimes they will post opportunities or give insight into trends in funding that might be relevant to you, and you kind of can go down a rabbit hole from there. And like I know the University of Houston, the Division of Research Office puts out funding newsletters, I believe, every week. So if you aren't subscribed to that, you might want to do that, because there's a lot of valuable information in there. So now we're at the proposal development phase. So this, which I can't stress this enough, but you have to be proactive. And the reason I say this is because there's a lot of key players that are going to be involved in this step of the process of the grant life cycle, that you want to stay in close contact with, because they will basically be assisting you in putting everything together. And if you are trying to crunch, you know, something that you should take maybe like 6 months to a year to start and plan and evaluate, if you're trying to crunch that into a 3-month time span or a 2-month time span, you might run into some problems. So always be proactive and start early. You want to create a timeline. You want to, and usually so depending on, you know, your strengths and weaknesses, everybody's different. Some people can come up with an idea, find funding, start the proposal development process and submission and all of that stuff within 6 months. But if you know there's some areas that you struggle with, you know, with regard to your research and your time management style, you might want to start a year out. But within that, whatever timeline you choose, you absolutely have to assess the project needs as well as any outside commitments. Let's say you're teaching, you're on a board for, you know, whatever organization, on top of trying to complete your research. Assess those needs prioritize what things you have on your plate currently, because that's really going to help you to figure out, how much time you need to devote to reviewing publications, reviewing articles, and how much time you need to devote to writing, things like that. And also, if there's something that maybe you're not very well versed in, but a particular colleague that might be a better fit at carrying out that part of the research, you want to reach out to them as early as possible as well, because you don't know what other time commitments that they have. And also, one thing to note about collaborators, this is why I say start the process early, just because that collaborator, that potential collaborator might be well versed in the area of expertise that you don't have, doesn't mean that they'll necessarily be a good fit for the research project. And I say this because a lot of times, something as simple as personality clashes could affect the outcome of the actual research. So take all those things into consideration. Reach out to as many people as you can as early as possible, because that'll help you to better navigate and to better evaluate who would be the best fit to help you carry out this research project. Also, you want to enlist colleagues to assist with proposal review as soon as possible. Again, considering everyone's time constraints and time commitments, things like that. You can also reach out to people at your in your research department. Every college specifically has a research administrator or a research liaison officer. You can also reach out to me. That's pretty much what I assist with, is proposal reviews, editing for logic, flow, formatting, things like that. Definitely enlist people to assist you with that, because it's only going to help uh, better the outcome of your proposal. And so this is just a breakdown of what you can expect from a typical proposal format. It's some things are interchangeable, some things are slightly different. Again, it depends on the sponsor or the awarding agency. But this is typically the format that people use when they're developing their proposal. And going back to that timeline that I advise you on creating, when you're coming up with your the writing process, a lot of times I like to tell people to take the proposal format that the sponsor has given them and break your timeline up into pieces based on the actual format of the proposal. I always tell people to write the executive summary or the abstract last, because that helps you to catch any pertinent parts that you might have forgotten. And so, but yeah, like the statement of need or significance, that could be, like at the beginning of your timeline, or, you know your style best. So just go and evaluate based on that. But basically what I'm saying is the proposal format that the sponsor gives you could be an excellent way to figure out how you want to complete your timeline and how you want to allocate your time based on the needs of the proposal. So the proposal submission phase is where you've pretty much decided that you know what you want to do. You have your proposal pretty much together. You've haven't tied up all the loose ends, and maybe you need like a final review for technical development, for compliance and things like that. This is where you reach out to your research administrator, or in our case for class, your research liaison officer. And so basically they are going to review your proposal for technical compliance. They're also going to review and create project budgets to ensure accuracy and compliance with UH guidelines. Now, when you're doing the proposal development phase, it might also be a good idea to contact your research administrator then, but according to usually within our college, most people usually contact the research liaison officer when they're actually ready to submit. They have like the bulk of the proposal developed, and so they contact the research administrator, towards the end of that process. But it's up to you. Again, you know your style, so it might be beneficial for you to contact the research administrator during the proposal development process. But you absolutely have to contact them when you're ready to submit, because they are the authorized person, the designated person to submit on behalf of the college as well as the university. And so with the proposal submission process, at most institutions, there's typically an internal process and an external process, which the external process is basically the submission itself. The internal process is not necessarily the submission, but it's more so an internal process to ensure compliance, and that relevant internal stakeholders are aware that of the proposed research being um, carried out. And so basically that would be like your department chairs, your college dean, and any other division of research personnel that need to be included in on this conversation, or included in the process. So basically our internal process is what we refer to as a transmittal process. And so basically what we're doing in this process is collecting basic information like who the PIs are, if there's any subaward or subcontracts or things like that. You know, if there's any facilities and administration splits between, you know, if the collaborators are from our college or if it's from a different department or things like that. We also collect, you know, budget information, proposal information. So basically everything that you would need to complete um, the external process, the submission process, you would also need it for the transmittal process. The only difference is with the transmittal process, you're not actually physically submitting through the transmittal process. That's actually the external submission, which is completed by your research administrator or your research liaison officer, and only that person. Depending on, here's one caveat to that, depending on the type of sponsor and depending on their verbiage in their guidelines, sometimes principal investigators or faculty can submit themselves and sometimes they cannot. Almost always when you are dealing with a federal agency, you will not submit it yourself. The research liaison officer or research administrator will always submit it for you. But there are times, say, when you're working with a private foundation, sometimes they'll specifically say in the guidelines, we do not make grants to individual, or we do not make grants to organizations, meaning it doesn't go through the institution, so you probably wouldn't need to contact your research liaison officer. I always say it's a good idea to do it anyway, because there might be some things that they could assist you with that you didn't think you would need assistance with. But if the sponsor specifically says we make grants directly to individuals, that usually means that the PI could submit it themselves. So again, when in doubt, ask your research personnel. You can ask myself or you can ask the research liaison officer. We'd be more than happy to assist you with differentiating the terms and conditions and the guidelines that sponsors set out if you're not sure. And so the award management phase is basically the proposal's been developed, it's been submitted, and now it's been awarded to you. So some of the key personnel that are in this phase, you probably hadn't interacted with in the pre-award phase, which everything proposal development and proposal submission is considered pre-award. So the award management phase is considered post-award. And so just like you have a research administrator or a research liaison officer for the pre-award phase, you also have a research administrator for the post-award phase. It'll be a different person than what you dealt with before. So some key personnel in the award management phase is obviously the principal investigator. It's going to be your post-award research administrator. It'll also be your research contracts officer, which I'll get into that in a little bit. And then it'll also be the executive director of the Office of Contracts and Grants. So in the award negotiation phase of award management, that's usually the award's been awarded to the principal investigator, and now you have to involve the executive director of Office of Contracts and Grants, as well as the research contracts officer, which is pretty much like the legal person that reviews the contracts to make sure they're, in compliance with what the university holds as standard and things like that. So this is at the award negotiation phase. These two people will probably be the main people that you work with, because they are basically negotiating the terms and awards of the agreement, reviewing to make sure it's in compliance with UH standards, and making sure that the needs of the sponsor fit within what the institution upholds, and things like that. And so if there's any verbiage that needs to be changed, or to make sure it's a good fit, or to make sure it's in compliance, those would probably be the two people that would be over this part of the award management phase. Then you have award setup. That's usually your research administrator for post-award. They will set up cost centers, get your budgets loaded for your project, and things like that. You will work with them a lot throughout the award management phase. They'll also assist you with expense monitoring and progress report submissions. So with the expense monitoring, it'll be the principal investigator involved, the post-award admin person involved, as well as your department business administrator. I know there's not listed as key personnel, but your DBA is actually one of the key personnel in the award management phase, because they are the ones that are charging the expenses to the grant, and ensuring compliance with UH policies and standards. So during that part, the expense monitoring phase, it's mainly the principal investigator and the department business administrator. And also with sub-recipient monitoring, that's if you enlisted the help of another institution or another PI as a collaborator on the project. So the post-award people will also be assisting with ensuring that the sub-awardee is in compliance with UH policies and standards, as well as the sponsor's policies and standards. So there's a lot of moving parts in the award management phase, but again, you have key personnel that you can reach out to that'll assist you with that. And later on in the presentation, I'll actually show you the responsibilities matrix throughout the grant life cycle to help you get a better understanding of key personnel involved. So the closeout process is at the very end of the award. This basically means that the sponsoring awarding agency determines that all applicable administrative actions and all required work of the award have been completed. So this is basically ensuring that all encumbrances have been cleared, that all expenditures that need to be expensed have been expensed, are in compliance with UH's policies and standards, as well as the sponsor's guidelines. This may also be the point within the project that the PI may realize they need a no-cost extension. Essentially what a no-cost extension is let's say you determine that you need a little bit more time to complete a certain phase within the research project, but you still have funds left remaining on the award. You can request well, depending on the sponsor, a lot of times you can request a no-cost extension, which basically means they'll extend the project out at no cost, like no additional cost, meaning they're not going to give you any additional money, but you'll have to use the funds that you still have left over to complete the project. A lot of times I've seen this with NIH awards. Usually no cost extensions, if it's the first one, it's pretty easy to get one. Of course, you have to have a good enough justification for it, but from my time in post-award, I had never seen a no-cost extension request rejected. Now, once it gets to the second request, it gets a little squirrely. There have been some instances where they've allowed it. Most of the time, they didn't. Again, you'd have to have a really good justification for that. A third time, that's in my experience, it's unheard of. So just be mindful of that as you're planning throughout your project, and anticipating how much time you'll actually need and things like that. So closeout processes, usually they have to be completed within 90 days of the end of the award period. At least that's typically what it is for federal agencies. Again, not all sponsors are created equally. You have to really, really pay attention to the guidelines, which your post-award administrator would be assisting you with that and deciphering that. And I know from my time in post-award, we would always, send constant, email reminders of certain things that needed to be completed at the start of the closeout phase. So, yeah, it can be pretty straightforward. Essentially what you're doing in the closeout phase is making sure everything's accounted for. If you have encumbrances, that they're cleared. If you've overspent, that those overspent funds are moved to another cost center and things like that. So this is basically, I like to think of closeout as the cleanup process, essentially. And so these are basically resources that you can use to kind of help you better understand the overall process. It mainly highlights like the pre-award and post-award processes. Going on to this responsibilities matrix, which I think will be really helpful for you because it'll help you get a better understanding of who you need to be contacting throughout the process. So essentially we have from the proposal development activities, you can see it lists out all the different responsibilities and who's accountable for those. So yeah, just whenever you get a chance, just take a quick glance at this so that you can, better assess what all you need to start preparing for if you do decide to pursue a funding opportunity. But yeah, it's pretty detailed and it's really, really, really helpful. I like to use it, if ever there's a question about something that I'm not sure who's responsible for it. So, let's see. Oh, and I think, well, the other links that I had linked on here were for pre-award and post-award guidance, so we can pretty much go to those right here. So pre-award guidance pretty much breaks down everything you would need to know in that phase of the grant life cycle. It gives you, a really good breakdown of specifically what you might run into, what forms might be necessary, and things like that. I like to use this this little grid because it pretty much details everything that I listed in the presentation about the different phases, specifically pre and post award, but it gives you an idea of what gets carried out during those phases. So when you have the time, this is a really good resource for you to review. And then this is also the post-award guidance. Basically, no cost extensions like I was explaining to you earlier. Basically gives you everything you would need to know about what would potentially go on during that process. So, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Does anyone have any questions about this?
No questions from my side. Thank you.
Okay,
No
awesome.
questions, thanks.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for attending. Again, I am in the class dean's office, and my name is Latricia Vaughns. You can look me up if you need to email me a question or anything like that. So thanks for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.